The recording, okay. So hello to everyone. Thank you so much for your presence. Today we have a new session of this research seminar that I organized at the Collège International de Philosophie in Paris with the support of the Walras-Pareto Center at the University of Lausanne and the Cité University in Paris. Today I have really the immense pleasure and honor of welcoming Sheila Dow, who I am really thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome her to this seminar. Sheila is really one of the most original thinkers of our time. She has published around 300 papers, books, edited volumes, book chapters on various topics, on monetary economics, on macroeconomics, on post-Keynesian economics, on the history of economic thought, amazing writings on specifically the Scottish Enlightenment. I also had the honor of co-editing a special issue of the Review of Economic Philosophy, where Sheila contributed to that issue with a wonderful paper entitled Scottish Enlightenment, Historical Epistemology and Modern Challenges for Economic Thought. That issue came out in 2021. So yes, so Sheila has written, as I said, so many different papers on these various topics, but also on the epistemology, methodology, the philosophy of economics. For example, she's the author of the Methodology of Macroeconomic Thought in 1998, with Alexander Dow of A History of Scottish Economic Thought, published by Routledge in 2006, with Richard Arena and Matthias Claus of Open Economics, Economics in Relation to Other Disciplines, published by Routledge in 2009, and with Jespersen and Geoff Tilley of The General Theory and Keynes for the 21st Century, which was published by Edward Elgar in 2018. And a large number of other wonderful, staggering, outstanding writings. I should also mention a very interesting collective volume that came out in 2022 by Routledge, edited by Iona Negru and Penelope Hawkins, entitled Economic Methodology, History and Pluralism. This volume is dedicated to the outstanding scholarship of Sheila. I highly recommend that you read that volume. For example, John Davis's very interesting chapter in that book entitled Sheila Dow's Open Systems Methodology. So without any further ado, I would give the floor to Sheila. Again, thank you so much for accepting my invitation. It's really a big honor and pleasure to have you here. You will have 60 to 75 minutes. Depending on the length of your talk, we would have between 40 minutes to around an hour for the Q&A, if that suits you. So please, the floor is yours, Sheila. And again, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Sina. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this seminar. It's a great project that you're running. I'm sorry that I can't be in person, but it's great to be able to make contact through Zoom and meet various people, including I can see names of old friends in attendance. So that's really nice. Now, my topic is values in different domains of economics, and I've listed the range of domains, and somebody might perhaps notice that I've changed the order of them. But the first draft of the paper, I had these domains in a different order, in a way because that seemed to make sense in terms, particularly of the way in which mainstream economics approached values. But I've decided to rearrange the order more in the way that I would naturally think of them. All the topics I'm going to touch on, you could have a paper on each of them. You could have a paper on the order in which we consider these domains. And the reason it's complex is because they're so interrelated. You have to choose one hierarchy or another, but in a way, there's an interplay between each of the areas. Anyway, I've settled on a different order, and I hope it works. But as you'll see as we go through, there are interdependencies that we can't really escape. Now, why is this not? I'm trying to. Don't know why that's happened. Okay, so the purpose I've set myself for the paper is to explore the nature and role of values in economics and their interconnections. In other words, the fact that different types of value have implications for other types of value within economics. Now, there's been a lot of literature on the subject of moral values within economics. And among those who study these things, seems to me to be a fair consensus that moral values are integral to all of economics. But of course, that is also contested in some quarters. But what I want to do is distinguish between different types of value and then see how each impacts on the others. So I'm focusing particularly on moral, ethical, and epistemological values. Again, there are issues of meaning here. I'm using moral in the sense of personal values, individual values, ethical in terms of social values, and I think epistemological should be self-evident. I mean, in some ways, the ethical is integral. It's subsumed within the moral. So, it really depends on one's value system, whether social values are pertinent or not. But hopefully, it'll become apparent in the discussion how we talk about these things. So, having drawn attention to the different types of values that are present within economics, I then want to think about how prioritizing some values over others is actually relevant when we look at ontology and then the motivation for inquiry, the way we approach inquiry through epistemology, and then finally the specifics of that approach, which is methodology. So let's start with ontology. And there are two domains and types of, two aspects of ontology that I want to focus on. The more general one is the economy itself, the socio-economic system, the subject matter of economics. And a key concept to consider in relation to the ontology of the economy is whether it's understood as an open system or as a closed system. I mean, this obviously entails thinking of the economy as a system. But we can see that a lot follows in terms of how values are employed by considering whether the economic system is considered as closed or as open, because that determines what the possibilities for knowledge actually are of the system. It determines the scope for epistemology. So there's a range of categories here that I've picked out, which are characteristic of either open systems or closed systems. And the first is whether the system is understood to be organic or atomistic? Is the system one where there are integral interrelations, or is it a system where the parts are separable? Now, the next set of categories is non-dualism and dualism. And you may notice that all my categories are in twos, which sound terribly dualistic. What I want to emphasize is that while we can contrast dualism with non-dualism, this is a distinction rather than a dichotomy in Putnam's sense. In other words, we have to draw distinctions in order to have any kind of category, in order to segment reality or conceptualizations in any way. It's a necessary feature of scientific inquiry or systematic inquiry. But it means that there's a huge range of possibilities for non-dualism. In other words, by getting away from hard and fast dichotomies, we can break up wholes, systems, in a whole range of different ways, and ways which are not dualistic. And we can feed that back into the first pairing, the organicism or atomism pairing. Atomism lends itself to dualism because it separates entities off from each other. That's a dichotomization of entities within a system. An organic system doesn't lend itself to dualism. It doesn't lend itself to separation. It lends itself much more to a focus on interconnectedness. And similarly, when we come to the third pairing, an organic system is one where emergence is a characteristic. The fact that entities change their form, they change the form of their interconnectedness. They evolve, whereas a dualistic, atomistic system is much more characterized by fixity as well as separation. The entities retain their meaning from one period to the next. The atomistic individual is the same throughout their lifetime, for example. And then the fourth pairing, uncertainty and certainty, it refers to knowledge clearly, but it's also a pairing that's a feature of the economic system itself. I mean, this is just one example of where having a hierarchy is tricky, because ontology is in a way dependent on epistemology. How do we know about ontology? How do we know about the nature of the economic system? Well, we require some theory of knowledge. And when we look at an economic system, the entities within it are conditioned by the uncertainty of knowledge or by the certainty of knowledge, depending on which we regard as the prevalent condition. So that in turn, for example, if the knowledge held within the economic system is primarily uncertain, then this conditions its organicism, the way in which the entities interact. Whereas if knowledge within the system is held with certainty, then that's much more amenable to fixity of meaning, to dualistic dichotomies, and to the entities being atomistic, being separable. So that in turn determines the scope for the economic role for moral values. Moral values are part of ontology. They're part of a socioeconomic system. But how we understand the system as being either open or closed will determine the role for moral values. So when we think of moral values in relation to ontology, the first thing we need to consider is the moral values of economic agents. These are part of the building blocks of the economic system. And agents hold moral values which determine their behavior. Now, when I'm talking about moral values, I'm thinking of values as ought statements in relation to moral positions. They're the basis for action, for decision making. But agents also employ other values, in particular epistemological values, which refer to the way in which it's regarded as appropriate to acquire knowledge and or information. I mean, again, these words reflect a particular ontology. Knowledge refers to an open system ontology where where knowledge is distinct from information in the sense of involving much more than what we might refer to as facts, but much more an understanding within which facts may hold sway. Whereas a closed system ontology lends itself much more to thinking about knowledge in the form of information, in the form of facts. Now, of course, economists are agents within a socioeconomic system, and we need to think about the values that economists apply when they approach their activity as economists. And again, economists will be motivated by moral values, indeed motivated by moral values to become economists and to pursue our study as economists. And then again, of course, we are influenced by epistemological values, which influence in turn how we pursue that moral motivation. And this in turn depends on the ontology that we as economists hold, whether we regard the economy as an open system or a closed system. Now, for agents' motivation, how we understand this, as I've already suggested, depends on ontology. And it depends on this open system, closed system distinction. What is our theory of the individual? Is the individual a self-interested atom, which is each of whom is separated from others within society? Or do we regard individuals as social beings, social entities, in which case the individual's moral position will also entail an ethical position, a view of what's desirable for society. But similarly, the economic system within which individuals operate is one which is conditioned by an institutional structure, as well as the less formal conventions which guide our behavior. So again, we can think of these in terms of an open system or a closed system. In an open system, these structures and conventions evolve, interact with each other, interact with individual agency, whereas in a closed system, institutional structures and conventions are given, they're fixed, and pre-specify the interactions between atomistic agents. Then when we come to to epistemological values, then the issue arises as to whether we're concerned primarily with knowledge or information. And it also raises the question of how agents deal with that knowledge or information. How do they gather it and how do they apply it? And in particular, the issue of rationality arises. We have a general open system concept of reasonableness, whereas the closed system concept is much more a narrow concept of rationality, which involves calculation. And so both of these entail some conceptualization of the type of knowledge that's possible within either an open system or a closed system. And finally, there's the issue of preferences. And it's possible that agents' values could simply be subsumed in preferences. And as in most mainstream theory, left unexamined. In other words, it's a way of dealing with preferences, but not actually drawing them out as something specific to see as influencing behavior. Now, economists' motivation understood in terms of values. First of all, in terms of moral values. When we read the informal discourse, interviews with economists, most economists, when pushed, will say that their motivation is to make the world a better place. Perhaps something more specific like socio-economic improvement. Or it could be something like promoting individual liberty as a sort of libertarian moral value. And most economists would imply that it's a moral value that is the starting point. But reading the interviews, I mean, Clammer's interviews were the pioneering ones, but interviews since then with leading economists suggests epistemological values as being very powerful. Intellectual pleasure is a very strong value. The fun of solving puzzles, arriving at answers. Or it might be something a bit more grand, like seeking truth. I mean, that again is a whole area. What do we mean by seeking truth? Is truth accessible? And if it is, what do we mean by it? But it is something that crops up as something that motivates economists. The third one is perhaps, however, the one that's been the most powerful driving force within economics, and that has been to promote the scientific standing of the discipline, that this has driven the way in which economics has evolved over the decades. Now, if we go back a bit to Adam Smith, his ontology, I would argue, is an open system one. I know Julie Nelson, I mean, my presentation in a way follows on from Julie Nelson's one 3 weeks ago, although I perhaps interpret him a little differently from the way she did. Adam Smith was very explicitly interested in what motivates science in general, not just economics. I mean, in his essay, The History of Astronomy, he talks about the psychological urge to set one's mind at ease when there's some new phenomenon. And this drives us to pursue knowledge. At an epistemological level, he might have said that there is an urge to seek truth, which would sort of fit into the discourse of the time. But he also made clear that because he held what we would now call an open system ontology, that truth was not accessible. We were not able to demonstrate the truth of any proposition because of the way the complexity of all systems, actually physical as well as social, which we were trying to understand. And therefore, the best we could do was to build arguments which we found persuasive ourselves, and then try to persuade others that these arguments were good ones. And it was, the sort of competition between arguments effectively, which determined the way in which science proceeded. Now, for Adam Smith, economics arose out of his teaching in moral philosophy. He used economics as a source of, he used economic topics as a way of helping students to grasp concepts within moral philosophy. I mean, students in those days were much younger than they are now. And in Scotland, in Glasgow, where Adam Smith taught, moral philosophy was taught in the first year as the basis for all other education. So these were young kids. He used topical subjects to try to help them to understand moral philosophy. And as Adam Smith developed his own economic thinking, he developed it as a moral science and applied a lot of the understanding that he laid out in the theory of moral sentiments. So what was meant by moral science was, first of all, behavior is influenced by the impartial spectator. This is the conscience, in a way, that we can access through our imagination, who observes how we behave and judges it. So we're constantly looking over our shoulder in order to make our own moral judgments. We also strive for things which we regard as morally appealing: self-fulfillment, prudence, the respect of others, and so on. And Smith also emphasized the limitations of monetary wealth as a source of happiness. There's this example of the poor man's son who develops enterprise and contributes to economic growth because he fools himself into thinking that he's going to be happy as a result. So that was Adam Smith's contribution to the idea of economics as a moral science. And this continued throughout the classical period. I mean, much less explicitly than in Adam Smith's case, but still regarding economics as a moral science. Now, this was particularly picked up by Marxist economics, and the marginalist revolution in a way was a reaction to that, deliberately changing economics to distance it from politics, which of course was a political movement. I mean, this is the, I mean, it just reflects this consensus that I referred to earlier, that while there's an attempt to take values out of economics, it inevitably involves value judgments, which was the case with the marginalist revolution. And one of the lasting legacies of the marginalist revolution was to pave the way for mathematical formalism. I mean, it was obviously a sort of process, but it's a process that reached its height in the post-war years and has continued to the present day, such that now mathematical formalism dominates mainstream economics, and for many mainstream economists actually defines the subject. Economics is study of an economic subject matter according to the principles of mathematical formalism. And formally, therefore, discussion of values was to be avoided, but we still see it in the informal discourse. And this is something that Deirdre McCloskey emphasized in her work on rhetoric. The economic values still clearly are present both in motivation and in the content of theory. Which is very different from modern heterodox economics, where ethical values are explicitly drawn out. I mean, it's made very clear that in heterodox economics that it's understood that values are inevitably embedded in economics, and it's important to make them explicit. Now, as it happens that I started writing this paper, it's for a volume in memory of Geoff Harcourt, who was a leading heterodox economist who died recently. And I chose to discuss Geoff Harcourt in terms of values because he's unusual even among heterodox economists by always prefacing his economics with a statement of values. And I've copied a couple here. I became an economist because I hated injustice, unemployment, and poverty. And the second statement simply elaborates on that first one. And of course, that this is regarded as rather improper in many circles for an economist to be so upfront about their values that it seems it's regarded as being unscientific. And yet Geoff Harcourt's making clear that this is what motivates, what motivated all his work in economics. So let's move now to epistemology and consider the implications of prioritizing one set of values or another for the way in which economics has evolved. Now, the idea of prioritizing the value of enhancing economics scientific standing is something that's been very widely discussed, and Phil Mirowski obviously has been a major contributor in this area. And it was a motivation from the marginalist revolution to develop economics as a social science, looking over the shoulder at the physical sciences, using concepts in the same way as the physical sciences, utils like units of energy, for example. And this was reinforced by adherence to logical positivism, the idea that economic epistemology should pursue the idea of developing logical statements, which would then be tested by facts. Now, of course, that ran into problems, notably the Durham-Quine hypothesis. And logical positivism ceased to be well regarded within the philosophy of science. But I've just been reading John Hart's work, and he actually has a paper in that 2022 volume that Sina referred to, where he develops the idea of naturalism as being the epistemological foundation which took over from logical positivism. Naturalism being the idea that economics should be understood in the same way as a natural science, and that study of economic methodology should simply describe rather than analyze. And he talks about it as an anti-philosophy position, which rules out any discussion of epistemological values, any discussion of truth, what it is, how we might approach it. Which means that my discussion here would be ruled out completely as totally irrelevant. So as you can see, I'm not very keen on naturalism. But it's a very interesting argument that this is, I mean, logical positivism had become a very weak epistemological basis for mainstream methodology, but now the suggestion is that naturalism has taken its place. But following on from logical positivism, which relied heavily on empirical testing, we also have the key role of the fact-value split, the idea that there are such things as value-free facts, which are available for testing economic theories. Gosh, I can't even see. I can't see the heading on this slide. Anyway, the implications of what I've just been talking about.
It's methodology prioritizing. Oh, okay.
Thank you. I guessed it. So the methodological implications of the epistemology I've just been talking about is to follow as far as possible the methods of the physical sciences. And for economics, that really requires a closed system ontology. Where the methods of the physical sciences require mathematical formalism, then as Tony Lawson, for example, argues, this implies that the ontology must be a closed system ontology. And what this does is narrow the scope of economics. And interestingly, the person that I've come across, I mean, I've written a paper with Vicky Chick on this several years ago, but otherwise, the person who's written on this most is De Breu, which is, it's really interesting to read him on his motivation, which includes making the world a better place, but a lot is about the psychological pleasure, the intellectual pleasure from solving puzzles. And what he points out is that by economists adopting mathematical epistemological principles, then the subject matter is limited to quantifiable entities, and the kind of entities which can be analysed within a closed system framework. So moral values of agents have to be included in preferences, not to be examined. They're just a datum. Ethical values have to be analysed in terms of social welfare analysis. Again, something that can be quantified and or analysed in terms of deductive mathematics. Quantification can be dealt with in principle, that in principle the gainers can compensate the losers, but it doesn't actually have to happen, so you don't actually have to quantify it. And he said, De Breu says quite explicitly that economics therefore has to accept the values of mathematics. And by which he means deductive mathematics. And therefore, even if you start off by saying that the goal is to improve the economic system for the benefit of real people, the scope for doing it is really constrained by insisting on this kind of methodology. So I mean, I find it really interesting that he should have been so aware of that argument. Now, if in fact what you want to do is prioritize the promotion of socioeconomic improvement, then the implications for epistemology follow from that being pursued within an open system ontology. Within an open system ontology, facts and values are intertwined endemically in the way that Hilary Putnam explains. And because of that, there's no scope for a value-free economics. And because of that, if values are actually embedded within economics, then it's really important to make them explicit. If the aim is to improve society, then that means according to some values. So you better make the values embedded in your analysis explicit to see if they fit the values that you want to apply to improving society. But with an open system ontology, we can only have an open system epistemology. And what this means is fallibilism, we can't demonstrate truth. But it also means, because of that, that we have a multiplicity of perspectives. If no one perspective can be demonstrated to be the best, then we have multiple perspectives. And this is the foundation really for the multiple schools of thought in heterodox economics. Once you move away from a closed system ontology, then there are many possibilities for open system ontology. It depends which source of openness you want to focus on, which depends on your ontology. Each school of thought has its own ontology. And this all implies a realist position that one's epistemology follows on from the ontology, that it's the nature of the real subject matter which determines how we can study it. Now, what does this imply for methodology? Well, first of all, if we carry on thinking in terms of realism, what we're aiming for is to identify causal tendencies as best we can within an open system. Because of fallibilism, the most robust way of doing this is to adopt a range of approaches, which means schools of thought, look at the different sources of openness and study their implications. This in turn involves a plurality of methodologies, and it needn't do, but normally would involve a plurality of methods. Geoff Harcourt's way of putting this was horses for courses. I'm not I don't follow racing myself, but I hope you understand the term. I mean, it depends on the context, essentially, what set of methods you employ, what's the particular focus of inquiry, what particular train of thought do you want to pursue. And further, the methodology involves an emphasis on the fact that within an open system, contexts evolve. In other words, working out best theory for a period of depression might still require new evolution of theorizing to deal with a period of inflation. And finally, there needs to be an emphasis on social structures in order to reflect the ethics which are predominant within society. Now, this is my concluding slide. What do I conclude? And my conclusions are all with respect to mainstream economics. I should have been upfront at the start. I'm a heterodox economist, and that's why that's the perspective from which I approach these questions. But it's not that I'm picking on mainstream economics. It's because values are not discussed within mainstream economics that I really want to sort of try and tease out what the issues are that need to be addressed and how we might address them. And this arises because these issues are not acknowledged and there are logical inconsistencies. And unfortunately, naturalism kind of encourages the idea that we don't actually have to address these things. The first one's the obvious one. There's the denial that there are implicit moral values. The second is that there's performativity. It's not just about the moral values that mainstream economics embeds in theory. It's the fact that there's actually a rhetorical influence on society itself. You know, the idea is conveyed that monetary value stands as a good proxy for other values. It detracts from study of care in society, for example. It implies that the marginal product is a good measure of somebody's value. Further, there's the implication that rational behavior is behavior which accords with rational economic man. It's calculative, and it's only calculative only with respect to monetary values. And so naturalism needs to be challenged because it can't accommodate this kind of discussion. It can't, and nor can it accommodate discussion of different perspectives among economists, far less different perspectives within society. Also unacknowledged is the necessity for a mainstream epistemology to be grounded in a closed system ontology, when most discussion, if it occurs among mainstream economists, implies that most people think the socioeconomic system is in fact open. There is this sort of continuing conflict between the formal discourse and the informal discourse. And, logical contradiction within a closed system logic is sort of unacceptable. I mean, I find it's rather strange that this should continue and be regarded as acceptable. So the bottom line is my argument that we need much more transparency about where values appear in economics, at what level, what the values are, what's being prioritized among these values. And finally, for philosophical consistency. So I guess naturalism is the big stumbling block, which I'm good to be thinking about this a lot more, having read John Hart's work. But that's where I've got to with this so far. So I'll be really happy to accept suggestions from you as to where I might go next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for this very wonderful talk. Really so closely related to the theme of the seminar. It was a pleasure to listen to all these observations, very interesting insights on various aspects. Really, I'm really grateful to you for the talk. Thank you so much. So I have now we can open up the discussion. I have a whole range of questions, but I would maybe start by giving the floor to the participants, to others present, and from time to time I would allow myself to ask a question or two. But just before maybe giving the floor to others, I would maybe want to ask one question that came to my mind immediately. Was about the influence of climate change and the discourse among certain ecological economists who sometimes tend to they tend to sometimes defend the identification of, let's say, natural and social studies for the sake of somehow neutralizing the overemphasis on subjectivity and personal preferences and things like that among mainstream economists. I don't know if I'm getting to my point is that how do you think we should deal with ecological economists who defend the identification? So, for example, they say that we should be using the methods of physical sciences to study even human interactions because, in fact, mainstream economists, they have not really done it. They said they would do it, but in fact, at the end of the day, they remained stuck at the level of, individual preferences and things like that, whereas we really want to be objective, so we would like to study things as objectively as possible, and it would be better to employ with the methods of the natural sciences.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And it's an interesting field for being a mixture of methodological positions or epistemological positions. I agree with you that there is this wish to relate to the physical sciences, and yet, there is a bit of a difference between ecological economics and environmental economics, whereas the environmental economics, in many ways, is more akin to, it draws more on neoclassical concepts and methods, so on. Whereas ecological economics is much more inclined to think in terms of process rather than equilibrium. And also to think in terms of social structures, so that, for example, rather than thinking of policies in terms just of monetary incentives, they'll focus on institutional structures and the way to encourage the formation of habits, which is something that we do in society as a way of dealing with uncertainty, that we act as social beings pursuing habits along with our neighbors. So it's a mix, really.
Yes, but for example, there was this book recently edited by Antoine Missimer, like the history of ecological economics. Absolutely, what you said is absolutely correct. But I think there are sometimes also tendencies among ecological economists. I have forgotten the name of this famous Georgius, very prominent economist who was like a physicist, became like a I would try to look him up, but for example, because like people sometimes who use concepts such as entropy, energy, things like that, to analyze the social domain, the social field, and sometimes it gets difficult because I entirely subscribe to your open, closed methodology and ontology, and this is really how I think about the difference between, for example, the study of social systems and the study of certain natural systems. But sometimes I get the impression that there are certain ecological thinkers who, for very different reasons than those relied on by, let's say, neoclassical economists, they subscribe to this non-distinction between natural and social sciences for the sake of for example, they say that, yes, precisely by emphasizing too much humans, we have completely overlooked the role of other natural entities, and for them, so.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether that's exclusivist or not, or whether it's something that can sit alongside a more sort of institutionalist kind of analysis. And I don't see why not, really. In a way, that would be a sort of pluralistic methodology to employ that kind of reasoning alongside institutionalist reasoning. But
yes, I really
it's like a good thing to
absolutely.
think about.
I really like this idea that precisely the open system foundation leads to the idea of fallibilism and precisely the proliferation of methods and the appreciation of pluralism. I think that's a very significant insight, I think, as you said, because maybe part of the problem of naturalism among most classical economists is precisely the idea of the exclusivity, and that is the method and that is the approach. All other approaches are unscientific, unrigorous, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I invite those present. If you have questions, remarks, please come forward. Yes, I apologize if I pronounce your first name incorrectly, but Dracopoulos, please.
Dracopoulos Stavros. Hello.
Hi,
Sheila.
Stavros.
Hi,
Nice
Sheila.
to see you.
I'm very glad to see you, even at a distance. But I'm sure I will see you in person in September. You're coming to Volos, I
Yes,
think, yes?
that's right. Yeah.
Okay, we'll meet there. We'll meet there then. Thank you very much for this extremely interesting talk. There is one point that I would like to have your view. You mentioned at one point that naturalism took over from logical positivism. Presumably that happened because somehow logical positivism was thought to be an outdated scientific philosophy. And if that's the case, what was the process? Because it is interesting that if mainstream economists are susceptible to that kind of change, then there is hope that something similar might happen to naturalism. What do you think about this?
Well, you're right. I mean, ideas do change. I mean, I guess the question is what's the mechanism? I mean, if by making sort of philosophical arguments and they deny the role for philosophy, it's a little tricky. But on the other hand, I sense, I mean, with certain individuals, you can see a movement in thinking. I mean, the fact that the unofficial discourse is so clearly at odds with the official discourse. You know, one feels that there must be some awareness of the problems with the official discourse. And it's just a matter of hope that this will be recognized, I guess.
Okay, and just one second, a clarification point. I suppose that you include methodological individualism in the framework of naturalism too. Is that right?
No, I've been thinking about that. I'm not quite sure what to do about methodological individualism. I mean, in some ways it fits so well with the sort of atomistic view of individuals that it could quite well fit in. But there again, see, it tends to be accompanied by a philosophical discussion about individualism, which doesn't fit with naturalism. But I have been thinking about that, and I haven't thought through exactly how to answer that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. So I, Mary Morgan. So thank you. So I give you the floor. Just before that, actually, the ecological economist I had in mind is Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen.
Oh,
I don't know if
yeah.
So he, for example, developed this whole physicalist way of studying human interactions with this notion of entropy. So when I face him, when I am, dealing with him, I don't know what to do with him, because he's on the one hand extremely critical of classical economics, but on the other hand, he's, even more somehow naturalist and physicalist than classical economics. But on the other hand, he's very sensitive to the issue of ecology.
Yes. Yes, no, I agree. He's a difficult figure to handle. And I mean, in many ways, his ideas are extremely useful in themselves. I mean, it depends how they're put together with other analyses. And of course, the other thing is, I mean, it's very easy to talk about mathematics as if it's a homogeneous whole, which of course it's not. And different forms of mathematical systems are more amenable to using within an open system analysis than others. I mean, even deductive mathematics can be used within an open system as a sort of provisional closure, but not as a sort of dominant system, which is how one would think of Georgescu-Roegen's system. I think there's a lot of mileage to be made in this, thinking about open system, closed system in terms of natural systems. I mean, I've just been focusing on the economy as an open system or a closed system. But the natural world as an open system is a really interesting thing to think about. And I'm sorry, I seem to be seeing a lot of there are a lot of things that I'd like to try and figure out here, but it's quite possible that the Georgescu-Roegen way of looking at things does, can be used as a way of, well, as it does, it sheds some light on how we understand the ecological system, but needn't be the be all and end all, that one needs some understanding of the socioeconomic system, which is different from that, to go alongside it in order to think about policy. And indeed, if you think of the natural world as an open system, then even from the point of view of physical sciences, his system might not be sufficient.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Mary, please, I give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheila. I enjoyed hearing this update about your ideas. So I have sort of two related comments, really. One is coming off the last discussion here about naturalism, which I'm having a bit of a hard time kind of pinning down, because, on the one hand, there's, ecology, environmental, biological, physical, and the one that you haven't mentioned, actually, which I think is where a lot of quite interesting intersections are going on, is the kind of cold chemical chemistry interaction with both biology and physics. So that's another whole kind of, if we're thinking about a natural science which is going places and changing, that would also be, for me, something that one might think about, because it kind of it's about the very small things and about quite large things, which I think has some kind of parallels in a way to economics, which thinks about individual choices, individual actions, and bigger things. So I'm not showing that's a role model, but I do think it kind of, what might be counted as natural might, is nicely changing at the moment to give us new possibilities. Okay, so that actually my question before that discussion took over was, so my, as you know, I'm kind of on the edge of economics, doing various different things, history and philosophy, but some sort of other stuff in history and philosophy of science. And if I stand back and think about what's happened to economics over the last, I don't know, 2 decades, I think that what's happened is whereas economists used to be bound by this very strong theoretical framework of rational economic choice and equilibrium, it seems to me much more now that that is not just a lip service to that, but often a referring back by some piece of work to how that would fit into that, rather than starting from that and everything growing from that. So I'm not sure how to evidence that except through conversations and talks and things like that. But it seems to me that the balance of where people are, economists are using that, you know, if you press them, they'll say, oh, yes, this is where we're starting from. But actually, when you listen to some of the talks, it seems the other way around, that they've got a problem. They're really trying to deal with a problem. And then they're seeing, not paying lip service, but seeing how, okay, so we have to think about the equilibrium, where would we, you know, we start with that. So that's one point. And I think from that is where we see another set of changes which might be related to that, which is that economic history is now a valid part of economics again. History matters. And that means that there's another kind of naturalism that's coming in, which is this whole sort of completely unwieldy historical development, all sorts of other things. So that and the Piketty effect, I mean, I don't think he's solely to blame, but this idea that actually what's really interesting in economics at the moment, what's driving a lot of young people in it, is really deep applied work, which is not superficial, but which is trying, not because they want to tell a health service how to run, although they probably do, but is trying to kind of figure out exactly how these very complicated socioeconomic institutions or things happen. You know, so if you look at, you know, recent presidents of the Royal Economic Society, you know, we've got Nick Crafts, who've had two brilliant applied economists, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that there's something to do with the values that current economists are operating under, even if they don't say that, which is giving recognition to a whole lot of other stuff, which might come under your naturalism, which starts with the econometrics and applied work rather than the theoretical individual. And I don't know quite how you'd want to put that into your framework, but it seems to me there's the interesting things are happening which might be fitted into what you're saying, rather than trying to say, no, you're on the wrong foot here, but they might be part of where you're seeing some of the answers. You know, where do economists see open systems? Well, they don't necessarily call them that, but in some of these places, that's essentially what they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, lots of interesting questions there, Mary. Thank you. First of all, on chemistry, I mean, that field, it is indeed very interesting, and it actually poses a particular question for me in relation to the way naturalism is talked about, and that is that there is open system theorizing in chemistry. Mm. I mean, Prigogine and Stenger's order out of chaos is an open system analysis, which, you know, is very helpful for economics, actually. So I'm not sure how the physical sciences actually conform to the way in which naturalist theory seems to portray it. So there's another whole layer there. In terms of what people are doing with applied work and sort of distancing themselves from the old general equilibrium kind of analysis of rational economic man, which, I mean, it was a very easy template for a closed system, which is less prevalent. But I mean, I look more at macroeconomics than microeconomics. And I mean, there's been a lot of discussion recently about macroeconomics, where it's going, because of there's always been this tussle between the pure and the applied. And I was quite taken aback that the Oxford group ended up, even those who'd expressed doubts about microfoundations, nevertheless saying, in principle, this is our goal, to build all of macroeconomics on microfoundations, essentially, on a rational economic man type of structure. So, I mean, when push comes to shove, it seems that it's still there as a goal, that this is regarded as, the ideal rigorous way of constructing macroeconomics. And yet, I mean, there's this continued distance between pure and applied. The applied being much more policy focused and much more sort of digging around in real data and understanding real institutional structures and so on. But in all these discussions about macroeconomics, there's no discussion about values. I mean, the only implicit value was about the rigor. I mean, there's another term that's very loaded of macroeconomics, and nothing about the values that are relevant to policy. So I mean, this is where my conclusion really. I mean, that's a case where I felt very frustrated that I wanted the contradictions to be addressed face on, and for the implicit values to be drawn out and discussed as you would expect within applied work, but it's not. So I agree things are changing, but these my concerns still apply.
Can I just come back briefly on that last point? I mean, it seems to me that as I say, when you push economists, they're going to go back to this, what we should be doing. But when I sort of think about, when I look at applied work, sorry, this phone is creating a problem. When I look at applied work and I sort of see the range of things that applied economists think are relevant, it's a much more open social space. So there's a value issue there, I think, which is in practice, which may not, when there's a justification for what's the right thing, doesn't seem to be there. But actually, in terms of what gets done, what you think is important that you want to deal with, then there's a kind of value, there's a set of values coming in, which is evident, but not actually discussed. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, which is interesting. I'd just like to see it discussed, that's all. Because there can be contradictions, that's the trouble. I mean, particularly if you go back to a sort of micro foundations approach, then the values embedded in that can contradict the values that you want to apply in applied work.
I think maybe if I could just add something to what Mary said, I think there is also this thing that, for example, when I looked at the work by Duflo, for example, sometimes the more experimental policy-inspired turn is also a move away from the idea is that we do more applied work centered on very explicitly formulated policy goals, but it sometimes comes at the cost of completely overlooking the broader structural motive. So, for example, this whole notion of Duclos that, she wants to replace politics with a big P with politics with a small p. And so there's also this, I think, sometimes in more recent experimental works, I think because it seems to me that you emphasize also the importance of paying attention to the structural, to the structure, basically, to broader structures at work in existing social, in the social situation. Whereas I tend to think that in recent macroeconomics or in recent work in, let's say, classical in mainstream economics, I don't see much attention paid to the structural aspect of the economic sphere, maybe other than, of course, with people like Piketty, but Piketty now doesn't call himself an economist anymore. I mean, ever since he has published Capital and Ideology, he says that he's not doing economics anymore, he's doing social science in general. So
yeah, I mean, the inattention to structure could be thought of as a particular, reflecting a particular ontology, which doesn't regard structure as an important feature of reality. You know, and the idea of doing experiments in development economics, it kind of reflects the view that you can compartmentalize and not pay attention to structure. So that's a view of the world.
yes, absolutely, which sometimes gets really problematic. I mean, politically speaking, for example, a lot of these works by Duflo, I mean, they just overlook entirely the whole political structure, social structure. They want to improve, for example, the schooling, the level of school attendance by simply installing CCTVs at the schools, whereas in fact the main cause of the absence of teachers at the schools is, a lot of far more structural causes. Okay, but I saw that there was also, yes, there are some questions in the discussion. I apologize if I think Anna, if you are there, do you want to ask your question out loud? I mean, the question that you have written in the discussion, or shall I read it? If you want, you can just.
Sina, please read my questions. My English is not very perfect.
Okay, you're welcome. Yes, please. Yes, so what is the measure criteria for morality in economics? How acceptable are immoral motives for economic performance or effectiveness? I think, and the follow-up is that does value-free economics mean moral value-free economics?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, a moral stance I use the expression to include an immoral stance in the sense that there's a whole range of moral stances, and there's bound to be disagreement over what's moral and what's immoral. I mean, for example, I'd suggested that methodological individualism was a moral stance. Selfish individual moral stance, which is quite widely, features quite widely within a lot of economics. So, I mean, you could say that that's immoral, but that doesn't mean not discussing it, because it is a possible moral stance. But are you suggesting that that might be important for making policies more effective? That if you can rely on people being selfish, then that would help policy, perhaps.
Sheila, may I try to ask? If I understand correctly, you just now said that methodological individualism is immoral. Is it so?
Well, it
This is
could be it could be regarded as immoral.
But this is fundamental principle of mainstream economics.
Yes.
And so what shall we do with this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you hold a moral position that that we are social beings and should look out for each other and prioritize social welfare.
Making profit, it's immoral in general, can be moral. If you put maximizing as a purpose, you should do it by any means. If you want to be moral, you should not put maximizing income as a purpose, if I say correctly.
Yes, yes. I mean, the way this was Adam Smith's invisible hand, that he thought the two went together, that you could pursue what you know, a selfish aim, and yet it would serve society. But
maybe in Adam Smith time it was working morally, but growing more and more, and now we can see that this principle is I don't know, probably not probably we should stop it or limit it or correct it. I don't know, but you mentioned ecological problem and many other problem, but with this principle you cannot solve ecological problem if we rely on this principle.
yes, I mean, there was Adam Smith had this example about an earthquake in China, which is very remote from Scotland, and what he pointed out was that somebody who had no connection with China might be more worried about losing his little finger than about the earthquake in China and all the loss of life. However, if the person, you know, the choice was losing a finger or the earthquake, if the person could actually influence the outcome of the earthquake, then they would happily give up their finger. You know, that was his idea of a sort of moral stance, that where actions have consequences and we can see what the consequences are, then that alters our priorities and alters our perception about what's morally right and what isn't. And that, I mean, that's an interesting example from the point of view of climate change, because, you know, in a small Western country, are people willing to accept a lower rate of economic growth in order to reduce carbon emissions to help people in remote countries they've never come across? I mean, the way that's the same as it's a sort of parallel argument that we're prepared to do that because it's the right thing to do, even though it doesn't sort of directly affect our well-being.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you. I am very glad to see you and listen to you. We met many years ago in Stirling. You don't remember me.
I'm better with faces than names. I'm sorry, because
my name is Alan.
Yeah, I can't see you, I'm afraid. So, but thanks for your question. Nice to meet you again.
There is a question also in the chat by Eve. Eve, do you want to ask it out loud, or shall I read your question?
Could you read it, please? Thank you.
You're welcome. So the question is, what do you think about the assertion of Steve Paxton which says that the link between what brings money to capitalists and what makes civilization progress is broken.
My, that's a big question. Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the context of that argument, but I mean, there is a lot of discussion about the current state of capitalism. Not least because of the distributional consequences of economic crises and responses to the crisis and to climate change. I mean, it certainly seems that there's a lot of scope for trying to align the interests of those organizing production and those interested in the progress of civilization. I mean, you could say that that's happening to some extent with the ESG movement, the way of trying to tie investment to more, you know, to investment projects which are more amenable to progressive civilization. So there is a sentiment there to achieve that, although it's kind of a rocky road for a variety of reasons. But at least there's a lot of thinking about that going on, which is a necessary ingredient if we're going to change things at all.
Thank you. There's also a question by Brian Simboli about the advent of the effect of behavioral economics and how it might break down the distinction between heterodox and orthodox economics. For example, the micro-foundational assumption that humans pursue very clear and predefined self-interest. For example, I know that John Davis, who is very inspired by your open closed system basic ontology, he tends, for example, to be rather optimistic about the long-term effects that behavioral economics would have on even let's say mainstream economics. What do you think about?
That's it's very pertinent to our discussion, actually, behavioral economics, because I mean, particularly if we think about the distinction between old behavioral economics and new behavioral economics, something that Esther Miriam Sent has written about in a whole article. The distinction comes down to methodology. And ultimately, I would say it comes down to epistemology and ontology. I mean, behavioral economics aims to address the reality of human behavior and try to explain the way in which experimental results imply that actual behavior doesn't conform to the way in which it's conventionally modeled. So, I mean, that is an exercise in realism. But I mean, I've come across statements from a whole range of new behavioral economists to the effect that all this realist work has to be reconfigured within a deductivist mathematical framework to be acceptable. And I've forgotten who it was, somebody says explicitly about how that methodology is at the top of the heap in terms of economics. If you want to gain a lot of esteem, then that's the way in which you have to couch your behavioral theory, which So I mean, that's happening in the same way as I was talking about it happening within macroeconomics, that there's still this compulsion to try and make theory conform to a notion of rigor, which is ultimately a deductive mathematical form of rigor. So the scope's there in behavioral economics. If it could just completely break away from that kind of methodology, which is, it's not necessary at all for the work that they're doing.
Interesting, yes.
If I may ask, what was the article that you mentioned about the distinction between the old and new behavioral?
It's by Esther Miriam Sent, and it's in Hope.
Okay.
About 2004, I would think.
2004. How do you spell her last name?
S-E-N-T.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Right.
Maybe before asking others to ask a question, so may I still ask your, I mean, what do you think about the link between, let's say, at the level of practical consequences and how economists should deal with economic issues, let's say practically speaking, how do you think we should conceive the link between the micro and the macro level, in the sense that, for example, when we think about issues of institutional importance, for example, the form of institutions, the goals of institutions, and things like that, to what extent, let's say, the exact idea and position of individuals, core individuals, should be taken into consideration, given that, I mean, you know, I don't know how to maybe exactly formulate it, but how because it is true also that, you know, of course, one position sometimes prevalent among, for example, those who defend this idea of public reason and public deliberations, such as then for them, ultimately discussions of institutional import should be only discussed, let's say, through a sort of public deliberation. It's only at that point that we should really be dealing with that sort of question. Whereas it seems to me that, for example, in the post-Keynesian tradition, we can also, you know, think about the reform of institutions, the change of institutions. And when we think at that sort of change, what is to what extent we should pay attention to what individuals think, core individuals.
Right. Another interesting question. I mean, first of all, there's the issue of the relation between microeconomics and macroeconomics. And from an open system perspective, there's no necessity to ground macroeconomics and microeconomics, or indeed the other way around, which is often suggested as a counterpoint. If you have an open organic system, you have to cut it up in some way in order to analyze it, in order to understand it. And the cut between micro and macro is a perfectly reasonable way of doing it. But then, of course, there's the meso level, which adds, I mean, which addresses the institutional structure, really, which can be understood separately. I mean, in terms of changing structures and where the individual comes into that process, I mean, it's partly a matter of politics, what one regards as the need for democracy and how that should be exercised. But if we think of individuals as social beings whose identity almost is conditioned by the institutional structure, you know, and perhaps more particularly by the informal institutional structure rather than the sort of formal institutional structure, then the formation of institutions or the reform of institutions impacts on the individual. I mean, I don't mean in terms of imposing costs or benefits or whatever, but just in terms of their place in the world, their place in society. And I mean, it was very much a priority of Keynes that semi-governmental institutions were the best mechanism for government intervention, really, that it should be done through institutions rather than by diktat, and in a way that allows a mediation between the individual and the state, which I think is quite important, quite appropriate. But there, I mean, raises a lot of additional issues. It's not an easy matter.
Interesting. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think there is also a follow-up question by Brian. Brian, do you want to expound on it? If you want to, you can. Yes, please.
Hi. Yeah, I think some of the discussion was heading in this direction of intermediation between, say, micro level analysis and macro level analysis. And I guess my training is in philosophy, but I find it very puzzling that so much economic literature doesn't really handle that intermediate level, which I think sometimes is characterized as mesoeconomic. But and the other piece of this I find fascinating is the mention of Keynes as recognizing the importance of these subsidiary structures in macro policy, being effective. But why is it that we don't hear more about these themes? Schumpeter, incidentally, I think I mentioned in the last podcast that Schumpeter had a view that was rather along these lines. I mean, sometimes it's maybe mischaracterized as corporatist, or that may be introducing some elements that aren't necessarily related directly to the first question I had. But I think Schumpeter was attuned to these kind of subsidiary structures, and you do get questions sometimes about the risk of a kind of Italian fascism setting in with these discussions about corporatism and intermediary structures if they get a little too close to high-level political authority. But a lot of issues there. Perhaps you want to comment on maybe the first part of that.
Yeah, well, on the sort of meso level, I mean, the people that I would turn to would be Kurt Doepfer and Jason Potts, who've written a lot on that. I mean, the context in which Keynes talked about semi-public institutions like universities, for example, was in terms of his political philosophy. That he argued that the state should perform functions that the private sector won't, for some reason or another, but as much as possible should be handled by semi-state institutions, sort of arm's length institutions. I mean, he had this view of sort of expertise that, beneficent experts would look after things, which was possibly a little over-optimistic on his part. But I mean, the idea that he saw a huge gap between the state imposing on people with nothing in between is not actually the case. I'm sorry, you were saying all sorts of interesting things there, but I've forgotten. Was there something else you wanted me to comment on?
No, that's very good. I suppose one question was whether Keynes was influenced by the currents of thought along these lines in the 1930s.
Yeah.
That arose, as a direct result of the Depression era, and how, whether this was possibly an important dimension of handling, the problems of poverty and such that were unemployment in particular. Well, what were his influences on that?
Well, one of his influences was Gesell on state monopoly of money, 100% reserve money, which he agreed with in principle at the theoretical level, but pointed out couldn't possibly work. But in terms of addressing unemployment, he was a small L, well, he was probably a liberal socialist, actually. I think that's how I'd characterize him. I mean, it depends what weight you want to put on which one, probably more on the liberal. But early on, he was keen to try to encourage private sector investment to deal with the problem of depression. But then he moved to impatience with the private sector, that he felt you couldn't count on the private sector to do what was required, and certainly not quickly enough. And he moved further and further towards the idea of state intervention. So, I mean, that was much less about building institutions, but much more about doing something to boost effective demand.
Yeah.
So it changed depending on the circumstances, which in a way is the sort of template for Keynes, that he was somebody who was very keen for thinking to evolve with the circumstances that were being addressed.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
If you don't mind, if I may ask maybe one last question on my part before asking others if they have maybe one or two last questions. Maybe it seems to me that one of the main justifications often used by certain strand of neoclassical economists to justify the idea of economics as a value-free science or non-moral or non-normative science is this idea that we do so because we do not want to impose the values that we have on others. This idea of like anti-paternalism, the idea that it's not that we are amoral or that we defend the fact of not having moral values. The idea is that we do not want to impose them on others. We would like to let individuals choose or express their moral values as they wish. So I think there's also this question then, of course, of paternalism, and that as soon as we accept the eminent role of values, moral values, ethical values, political values in economics, then what shall we do about? I mean, how should be the? I mean, what shall we do with this notion of paternalism and this idea that if you go too much into this idea of moral values, ethical values, you would definitely end up somehow imposing your values on others, and that to avoid paternalism, we should try to make science as value-free as possible somehow.
Yeah, well, in spite of their best efforts, economists can't do it. I mean, it's proved to be impossible to construct economic theories which don't have some values embedded, and that's even more dangerous than a straightforward paternalistic imposition of values, because it's not actually admitting that the values are being imposed. So, I mean, there is a point beyond which it would be impossible to design policy, for a government to design policy if there was a constant turning over of discussion of values and part of this group or that group. But at a general level, there should be scope for discussing the values of different groups within society, for example. I mean, there's so much discussion along these lines in terms of diversity and decolonization and so on, where people are raising these questions that moral values have been imposed which don't suit a particular society and is democratically unacceptable. So I think the wish is there, but to eradicate values. But I just don't see how it can be done, and it's much better to be transparent about the values that are imposed. I mean, this is where schools of thought are helpful, actually. I mean, I know there's some resistance to this notion of schools of thought, but it's always struck me that it's actually really useful to have a sort of shorthand for a particular way of looking at the economic system and how to analyze it. So that, you know, if you get a group of post-Keynesians, you know, there'll be arguments, but there's an awful lot of shared views which don't need to be gone over. And therefore you can actually make some progress within that perspective. So if you're a government trying to decide what policy to pursue, I mean, an implication of what I've been saying is that you might want to bring in a neoclassical economist, a post-Keynesian, maybe a Marxist, neo-Austrian, you know roughly where they stand and what their, I mean, not always know what their moral position is, but you could certainly sort of ask what the representative moral position is. And that would help a government form a view about, you know, in a pluralistic way, about what kind of policy to pursue.
Interesting, but may I ask if, because you refer to Putnam, because part of the reason why Putnam is critical of the fact-value separation is that, as he says, often this separation was used to then argue that only a study of facts can be objective, whereas anything having to do with values is merely subjective. So
Yeah.
he implicitly defends this idea of the possibility of at least having objective discussion of at least specific categories of values and norms. Do you think that objectivity is an ideal that we should keep when it comes to appraising social values, ethical values, moral values? Or do you think, because there are also some people who tend to think that even, you know, like there are values, moral values, and so on, they should be expressed, but that there is no hope for attaining any form of objective assessment of them. So we cannot evade them.
Yeah.
There is no way we can avoid them. They are, how to put it, unavoidable, but there is no hope of attaining objectivity of, for example, deciding whether maybe some values are more reasonable than others and so on. What do you think about that?
Yes, so I thought when you were starting to talk about, you meant objective description, but which itself is challenging. You know, actually categorizing values itself, one can aim for objectivity, but whether you can achieve it or not is debatable. In terms of objectively weighing up different moral values, I mean, you'd need an uber moral value to do that. And the point is there isn't one, I guess. But I mean, for example, if you think of politics, a government's elected by a majority through some system or another, where the majority shares some kind of understanding of the way the world is and a set of values about how it should be changed, if at all. And that gives the government the legitimacy to impose those values. But a sensible government would also pay attention to the fact that there are other values in society, and they might want to, take that into account in terms of particular policies. For example, policies addressed to a particular segment of society. It would be good to know what the set of values was that was relevant for that particular segment. So again, it all comes down to transparency, even if what is being, it's not complete transparency and it's not complete objectivity. It's a very open system way of I'm expressing myself. It's just sort of trying to do the best you can in the circumstances.
Yes, thank you so much. So maybe we have time, if you allow me to, well, for one last question, I invite those present, if you have a final question or comment, please come forward. Specifically, the ladies present, if you want to come forward, ask questions, please do so. Otherwise, I should, no more questions, comments. If not, then I should again sincerely thank you so much, Sheila, for this wonderful talk, for very interesting discussion, for your answers to the questions. Again, I am very happy that I had this occasion, singular, unique occasion to meet you. I really hope to have the opportunity to meet you in person sometimes soon. I would add the recording of this talk to the YouTube channel of the seminar. And just before you leave, I shall remind you that next week we also have one more session before we start the seminar for at least a month or two. But next week we will have a talk by George Martino, who will give a talk related to his recent book entitled "How Economists Cause Harm Even as They Aspire to Do Good, the Tragic Science." So I think that talk also promises to be interesting. So if you are free, please don't hesitate to join us for that talk, which would start at 6 p.m. Central European time, so a little bit later than this talk. Sheila, thank you so much. I'm utterly grateful. Thank you really for the talk. Thank you also to all the participants. I really appreciate your presence, and I look very forward to seeing you in the close future, hopefully next week. So have an excellent evening and an even better weekend.
Well, thank you, and thank you everybody for your questions. It's been very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. Have an excellent evening.
You too.